Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you very much for being here. This is Activating the Temple of Light, the great secret of the lost rod and ring of Jesus. So we're going to be looking at some very interesting material today that encompasses a lot of ancient material about this lost rod and ring, but also modern Nashville as well. We're going to tie together these subjects in a very extraordinary way. I wanted to introduce this presentation with a quote. No one lights a lamp and puts it in a place where it will be hidden or under a bowl. Instead, he puts it on its stand so that those who come in may see the light. We're going to end our day today at a light stand, in a sense, a temple facility that matches the ancient description of the rod and ring that once was attributed to Jesus, but which we're going to see has a very, very ancient pedigree. I always like to begin with a brief introduction about who I am. I call myself an investigative mythologist. This is sort of like being an investigative journalist, except my focus is mythology. A traditional mythologist will look at myth and scripture and they'll say, okay, there's a literal understanding here, there's a historical understanding, there's a allegorical, symbolical understanding in these texts. There's also a metaphorical understanding, and very often they'll stop with those four levels of interpretation. But I've added a couple other additional levels. I believe that myth and scripture are loaded with references to ancient technology. I also believe that myth and scripture are loaded with references to an anatomical understanding, a higher spiritual functioning of the human body. And it's become my quest to understand this coding about this ancient technology and the spiritual functioning of the human body. My logo comes from the Egyptian god Osiris, who was the god of resurrection. He was sort of a prototype for Jesus, many scholars believe. And what we see in his hieroglyph here is a gateway or a shrine that is flanked by two pillars or towers called the Tet pillars, power pillars. We see another symbol over here called the Shuti pillar, which has a serpent levitating upon the pillar. When we put those symbols together, we form a complete device that the ancient Egyptians called Osiris. And I use that word device very intentionally because when you look up the word device in the dictionary, it says that you're dealing with a technology, with an appliance, with a tool, and also with a symbol. Think of a heraldic device, a heraldic symbol. And so I believe that this Osiris device is all of those things. I think my research reveals anyway that Osiris was a tool. It was an appliance. It was a technology, and it was also a symbol for a whole host of sciences. What we see on the left is Isis tending Osiris, and beside it is a color rendition of this done by my artistic collaborator, Mr. Dana Augustine. And so we can see that it looks on the surface to be technological. If it is in fact a technology, a tool, what function did this device serve? Well, the Egyptians were very clear. Osiris was called the tower. The tower. And what tower meant was the bond between heaven and earth. That was its function. This device was the tree of life, the ladder or stairway to heaven, according to the Egyptians. That's what it did. And so we have to imagine we're dealing with a technology that unites heaven and earth. Here in this complete rendition of Osiris being operated by Isis, which today is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, but which originally hung on the wall at Abydos in Egypt, we see an individual, the pharaoh, serving food to Osiris. What this indicates is that this tool had a completely peaceful purpose. They're not offering dead bodies to it. They're not offering dead animals to it, like you see in other shrines or other holy places. They're offering food to this device. And it brings up a very important point when we're looking at depictions such as this. we have to factor in the Babylonian and the Egyptian concept of sin. And I want to talk about that just briefly here. In the Babylonian doctrine of sin, which came from Egypt, they tell us that these ancient temples which featured such imagery were not places of worship. They were places where people worked for the gods. They were workshops. And the work that humankind did for the gods at these temple workshops was we served them food. The catch was that in order for humans to serve food to the gods, we had to be pure beings. The gods didn't want to eat contaminated food. So they took a select group of people, priests and priestesses, and taught them to become pure beings capable of serving that food. And then these pure beings worked for the gods. This work is actually what alchemists later called the great work, the magnum opus, the process of transmuting an impure soul into a pure soul. So it wasn't that we literally served them food, it's that we worked for the gods, and in working for the gods, we became gods ourselves and became star walkers with the gods. Enoch, Ezekiel, Elijah, John the Baptist, Mary Magdalene, Jesus are all figures who studied in these temple workshops and in fact became servants of the greater God. They became gods themselves. The way the gods knew that you weren't doing the work, that you were not serving them, was your hair turned gray. You aged. You weren't doing the alchemical work that made you an immortal being. That was the definition of sin, not doing the work. And then, of course, Christianity came along and totally demolished this whole concept, blew it up beyond all recognition. And no longer do we work for the gods, we worship a God in a master-to-slave relationship.